Welcome to Mystere Creations. I'm your host AJ, and today I am speaking with Dr. Justin Sledge about Kabbalah and his channel Esoterica. His knowledge of this and many other esoteric subjects is helping to bring the hidden forward, making the esoteric less esoteric. Now on to the show. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Sure. Hi, folks. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge. I am a university teacher. I work in philosophy and religious studies, and I'm probably more well-known as the host of the channel Esoterica, which is a YouTube channel that studies the academic side of Western esotericism. So that would include things like alchemy, Kabbalah, magic, the occult, and things like that. So I work both as a university lecturer, but also as a YouTube host, popularizing the study of academic Western esotericism.
Wonderful. That's where I found you, at the request of my teacher Marco Visconti. He really enjoyed many of your YouTube lectures and suggested you to me.
Wonderful. Marco's a great guy.
Yes, he is. In Jewish mysticism, it's a very ancient system, many different aspects. How far back do you theorize that it goes, and can you tell us anything about pre-Kabbalah mysticism?
So we should separate between Jewish mysticism as a general category and Kabbalah as a form of Jewish mysticism. So Kabbalah, as we know it, really dates back to the 13th, maybe the very end of the 12th century of the Common Era. It originated primarily in southern France and in Spain. So that's Kabbalah, and that's the mysticism that most people know about. Prior to that, there were other forms of Jewish mysticism that we now typically refer to as Hechalot or Merkava mysticism. This is a form of mysticism in which something like Jewish shamans would attempt to travel to the realm of the divine, the palaces of the divine, in order to pass through the various heavens or the various palaces of God. That's the word Hechalot, Hechal. And by descending into the God's divine realm, they would eventually be given a glimpse of the divine throne. And once they were given a glimpse of the divine throne, they could even be sometimes transformed themselves into an angel. That form of mysticism dates back quite a ways. Depending on how you calculate it, it may date back all the way to the visions that Ezekiel had during the Judean exile in Babylon in the 6th century BCE. So that's really early. Okay. But certainly we have manuscripts of this mystical tradition that date to toward the Talmudic period. So this is the 5th or 6th century of the Common Era. So it dates back quite far, probably to the Second Temple period. We don't have a ton of literary evidence for that, but we certainly have literary evidence published sometime between the Mishnah and the 3rd century, the very beginning of the 3rd century Common Era, and the composition of the Babylonian Talmud in the 6th or 7th century of the Common Era. And so it's important for people to realize that the Kabbalah has existed for about 800 years. That's been the dominant form of Jewish mysticism for the past 800 years. But for the 800 years prior to that, Merkava mysticism, Hechalot mysticism, was the dominant form of Jewish mysticism prior to that. There's even some glimpses of it in the New Testament where Paul talks about being taken up to the third heaven. That's probably a reference to these practices, even back in the New Testament. So that's back certainly in the 1st century. So these are very, very, very old forms of mysticism, of which we have, substantial literary remains.
I wonder if there would be any record in the Babylonian tablets that would speak to something even earlier.
It's possible. I mean, most religions have some degree of supernatural travel in their religion, whether it's shamanic journeys to the spirit realm or something like that. As far as Babylonian tablets, I mean, there is some evidence of the Judean presence after the Babylonian exile in 586 that actually are recorded in some of these Babylonian tablets. But most of those tablets are about purchases and grain exchanges and receipts and things like that. So no religious text about the Judean presence in Babylon at that time, or very little religious practice or presence. So probably not there, but it certainly was the case that, assuming Ezekiel is engaged or a part of this tradition, or maybe the progenitor of it, it could have been practiced. And the visions that both Ezekiel and Isaiah have in their respective prophetic books could be an early stratum of this form of Jewish visionary mysticism. It's also worth mentioning that form of mysticism was actually taken up into the Kabbalah and survives. I mean, it's a form of mysticism that it's not like the Kabbalah destroyed it. The Kabbalah changed it, transformed it dramatically. And there are, for instance, Hechelot texts, novel Hechelot texts that are actually appended into the Sefer Zohar, of course, the most important book of the Kabbalah. So one shouldn't think of it just as there was Hechelot, Merkava mysticism, and then Kabbalah arose and Kabbalah got rid of it. More that Kabbalah absorbed it and transformed it.
Kabbalah has withstood the test of time and multiple tragedies and criticisms. Each time it comes out stronger and a little better. Why do you think it has held fast, and how do you think it will evolve into the future?
So yeah, Kabbalah has endured a lot of tragedies. One can think of the exile of 1492, the Alhambra decree that was catastrophic for the Jewish communities in Spain, where the Kabbalah was basically born, and of course later things with everything with the Holocaust. So yes, Kabbalah has endured, and I think it probably has endured because Jewish people have endured. Judaism is a religion that has benefited from the fact that it is not centralized. There is no Jewish pope. There is no Jewish church. There's no way to get Jews all in one place and kill them all. And so because we are a diasporic people, and because our theology is a diasporic theology, Kabbalah has out to an end, but in a very specific kind of way. So what I would say is I think that Kabbalah has just withstood the test of time because Jews have, and it's just a part of, in the same way that Thomism has become basically the theology of Catholicism at some level, Kabbalah has just become the theology of Jewish people. And so insofar as Jewish people have survived, then Kabbalah has survived and will go on to survive. Now, how will it evolve into the future? That's a great question, because a big part of what happened in the 20th century was that Kabbalah was actively suppressed by many movements of Judaism. And it was only really in the 1960s and 70s, and really a little bit after that it became, back into the Jewish mainstream. And so I think that will probably happen is that a strange thing will occur where Kabbalah will get normalized as a form of theology within the liberal Jewish community. Of course, the Haredi Jewish community, the Orthodox community, is also undergoing apparently innovations in the world of Kabbalistic practice and theory. And so the real question will be, will Kabbalah as it's practiced in the ultra-Orthodox Haredi world, how will that look compared to Kabbalah as it develops in the more liberal progressive world? And I suspect they won't look much alike, but they are evolving and progressing on their own. So I'm not one to predict the future. I think that's always a losing bet. Yeah. But I do think that one of the more interesting things that will occur is that Kabbalah will become renormalized in the progressive Jewish world, where people will be, for instance, studying the Sefer Zohar for the first time, and there may be entire communities for the first time studying the Sefer Zohar as a canonical piece of Judaism, whereas for the past couple hundred years, it has been practically forgotten as a canonical piece of Judaism.
Yeah. Everyone has heard of about the Zohar, but in your lecture, you mentioned a few unknown books of Kabbalah. What is one book you wish would be studied more?
Yeah, what is the one book you wish people knew more about? So the Zohar, obviously, I wish people knew more about it because it's the foundational text. You can't do Kabbalah without studying the Zohar. It's simply impossible. So you have to learn to study the Zohar to understand Kabbalah. What book would I say that I wish were more available, more studied? So if you've gotten a relatively good mastery of Kabbalah and a relatively good mastery of the Zohar, I think the book that I would really encourage people to read, which there's no translation of, unfortunately, is Moshe Cordevero's The Garden of the Pomegranates, the Pardes Rumomim. It's probably the most. I would get flack for this by the Lurianic people out there, but they can come at me, bro. I find Lurianic Kabbalah to be too baroque and too contradictory and basically a big mess. Moshe Cordovero had a much more rational system, much more systematic understanding of Zohar, and a much more coherent system for understanding what goes on in the Sefer Zohar. And so I would say that Cordovero's Pardes Rumomim is actually a much more rigorous, much clearer, much less contradictory system for understanding what's going on in the Zohar and what's going on in terms of understanding the nature of the Sefirot and the nature of the origin of the world and the origin of evil. And so I would say that, I would really be on Team Cordovero, and I really wish that there were a really good translation of his Pardes Rumomim. There's not one on the horizon to my knowledge. The book is pretty extensive. It's a substantial tome, even in Hebrew. I suspect that if it were translated in English, it'd probably go into 4 or 5 volumes at least. So it's a chunk of a tome. So I would say that in addition to that, he also wrote an extraordinarily long commentary on the Zohar itself. I think that is ongoing in publication. I think they're up in 23, 24 volumes. So okay. It is a substantial text. So I would say what I would love to see is the corpus of Cordovero get studied, get translated, people could get access to it. I'm just thankful that the Zohar is available now, that people can take, and people who don't read English or don't read Aramaic rather, and they can pick up the Pritzker version by Daniel Matt, and with the exception of some pretty important sections that are not translated, like the Raya Mehemna, they can get access to the Zohar in a very approachable edition. So again, just be very thankful about what's out there, as opposed to not being thankful for what's out there and demanding more. And so now the Zohar's out there. Maybe in a generation after I'm dead, Pardes Rumomim will be eventually rendered into English as well.
Hopefully before then.
I don't count on it, but it'd be nice. But I think that if people really want to study it, they should probably be working on their Hebrew at this point.
Right now I'm trying to learn Sumer, and that is one of the most difficult languages I've ever encountered. So I think I might step into Hebrew and basically bang my head against the wall, because it's another language that's very big to learn, from what I've heard.
I would say that in many ways that it's much easier to learn to read Hebrew than Sumerian. Sumerian's a very unusual language, and you kind of have to read. You have to learn to read Akkadian first, basically, because we don't really. Yeah, so we're always reading Sumerian through an Akkadian glass, darkly. Which is the same way, by the way, if you learn Aramaic. No one just learns Aramaic. You're always learning Aramaic via learning Hebrew. So some people are like, I want to learn to read the Zohar in the original. I'm like, well, take 3 semesters of Hebrew and then begin thinking about learning Aramaic. And then the peculiar Aramaic of the Zohar. So
studies that will take me the rest of my life.
At least a life.
Can you talk a little bit about Zoroastrianism and its influence on Jewish mysticism?
So this is a bit of a controversial topic these days, so I'm going to be careful about what I say. At some point, the Babylonian Empire sacked by the Persians, right? So after 586, the Judeans are exiled to Babylon. Not long after that, 20, 30 years later, the Persian Empire overthrows it. The Persian Empire seems to have had some kind of dualistic religion as its state religion. Probably some version of Zoroastrianism. We don't know exactly, actually, but probably some version of Zoroastrianism. And it seems like that religion was already kind of there, also around in the Babylonian Empire as well, sort of a religion that was around. And it seems like at some level, some ideas from what we call Zoroastrianism, like dualism, like messianism, like the afterlife, like angels and demons, and tours of heavens and hells and things like this, things that we see in Zoroastrian literature, also seem to have a direct impact on the Judeans that go home from the exile in Babylon when they're released by Cyrus the Great, and they begin the process of rebuilding their homeland, and also as basically as a satrap of the Persian Empire. Cyrus wasn't doing it out of the goodness of his heart; he was doing it in order to rebuild his empire, basically have a buffer between him and the Egyptians until he conquered the Egyptians. And so it's unimaginable that these people went into those regions with a very provincial religion, if we're being honest, and didn't come back being influenced by an incredibly ancient culture and an incredibly powerful world religion like Zoroastrianism. And so the guess these days is that these elements, dualism, angels and demons, messianism, none of those elements are to be found in Israelite religion. They return from Babylon, and all of a sudden we see a lot of literature being written that seems to incorporate those ideas, things like the books of Enoch, the book of Daniel. And from those texts, it seems like what we're getting is some degree of dualistic Persian, quote unquote, Zoroastrian influence. And typically we call that synthesis, Jewish apocalypticism. And so insofar as Jewish apocalypticism and Jewish mysticism, like Chekalot Merkava mysticism, intersect, then we can say that Zoroastrianism has had some kind of impact on them. But the truth of the matter is, it's really difficult to pin down exactly where those lines lie. And so most people are confident there's some impact, but showing the exact causal mechanism of the impact, there's still there's ongoing debate about exactly what that looked like historically. But I think most people agree that there's some impact, but when the impact happened, to what degree it happened, how it lined up, et cetera, et cetera. I think that people are still painting with pretty broad brushstrokes in that regard.
Do you have any tips for anyone looking to study the Zohar?
Yeah, this is a big task. I actually have a whole video on my channel about this, just sort of study tips for the Zohar. What I would say is, if you really want to study the Zohar, there are some parts of it that are harder than others. So don't start with the hard parts. So I would start with some of the easier parts. The earlier parts of this composition of Zohar are a bit more easy to understand. This is a section of the Zohar called the Midrash HaNa'ilam, the hidden Midrash. Those sections are a bit easier to understand. There are also shorter pericopes in the Zohar that are little textual units, like the Saba de Mishpashtim, or the Yanuka, the child, or the old man, the donkey driver. And those sections contain a lot of good Zohar stuff, but they're contained. So you're not just like spinning your wheels about what in the world's going on in these sections. So I would say that you would want to scale up your Zohar so that you're not starting at the most difficult parts, because those parts are completely inaccessible if you don't know what's going on in them. I know what's going on in them, and I still don't know what's going on in them. Some of those sections are just impenetrable. So I would say plan your Zohar study around scaling yourself up, not just diving in randomly.
Okay.
The Zohar is largely a commentary on the Torah. So if you don't have your Torah chops up, you need to study the Torah a bit. So I would say that if you're going to go read a section when the Zohar comments on the Torah, you need to go read the actual Torah section first and have a really good grasp around what's going on in there. Because if you don't understand what's going on in that section of the Torah, there's no way you're going to be able to understand a commentary on it, much less a crazy mystical commentary on it. So, it's like anything else. If someone said, "Hey, how do I learn to ride a motorcycle?" I'd probably say, "Go learn to ride a bike." And if you told me, right, that you know how to ride a bike, or something like that, I'd be like, "Well, you probably don't want to start with a motorcycle. You need to figure out what your balance is and things like that." So it's like anything else. I would say that with the Zohar, you would want to start off small and then work your way up. And the way you do that is by acquainting yourself with the Bible, acquainting yourself with the Torah, acquainting yourself with Jewish commentary literature, acquainting yourself with the Talmud. The Zohar assumes you know all that stuff, basically by heart.
Yeah.
And then work your way up. Lastly, and I think it would be important, but it's not a total barrier, you got to learn some languages. You're just never going to really understand Kabbalah without having Hebrew, and you're never really going to get it, the Zohar, without having some grasp of its very unusual Aramaic. And I know that sounds like a tall order, and it is a tall order, but again, it's all about how much work you're willing to put in terms of what you're willing to get out of it. And, that will be a thing that one will have to do. So it's tough, but you can do it. At the same time, if you don't want to do all that, you can just pick up a copy of the Pritzker Zohar in English and go to work. And it will be hard and confusing and bewildering, and that's healthy. And over time, it will begin to make sense. I can't tell you how long that will take, but it will begin to work itself out as you study the commentaries and as you study really getting into the language of it. And eventually you'll get your chops and you'll be off to the races. Again, how long that will take? Probably on the order of years, I would suspect.
Yeah. There's a reason why they said that you weren't allowed to learn the Kabbalah until you were 40, because it takes a long time to learn the language, learn the religion, learn the stuff that's before to start learning that.
And not just that, but that you're married, that you have kids, that your mind is already stable.
Developed.
Yeah. And the idea is that that you're not going to go off the deep end. Although those rules were actually only instituted after the whole fiasco with Shabbatai Tzvi, the false messiah in the 17th century. Prior to that, people studied the Kabbalah at very young ages. Cordovero, the guy I was just talking about earlier, he actually writes a book about how to become a Kabbalist. And he says, I've started studying Kabbalah when I was like 23. So, so that whole 40 thing, yeah, it's a rule of thumb, but it's not it's not God's law. There's not like rules of Kabbalah, be 40 and be married. That's not in there. It's a rule of thumb, and there's good reasons for it, but it's not some, I'm only 40 now. I just turned 41 last year. I've been studying Kabbalah for years. So.
Okay. I think being emotionally stable is the requirement, because in coming from a magical standpoint, emotion is the medium by which magic is cast. And if you're not emotionally stable, that energy that you put out is going to be all over the place. And so learning a mystical side of things requires you to have some stable base to work from.
Yeah, I would say emotional stability, psychological stability. You need financial stability. You need time. It takes time. You need to be able to, you need to be able to not work all the time to study this stuff. You need to have all psychological stability, emotional stability, mental stability. This stuff is very weird. So sure, I totally agree that I would not hand someone who's unstable a mystical text.
No, that's how you end up with cults and
psychotic people. Yeah, through no fault of their own.
True. Well, Kundalini experiences. If you go into a situation like that, or take ayahuasca, you can go insane just from doing that. And it's recommended that you learn something of what you're doing before you step into it. That's good. It's good advice.
I'd agree.
Can you talk about a little bit about gender fluidity in Kabbalah?
Yeah. So one of the central symbols in Kabbalah is the balancing of the male and the female. The Kabbalah understands the divine as being both male and female. And what you have to understand about the Sefirot is that all of them are some aspect of male and female, and that the task of the Kabbalists and the task of the Jewish people, according to the Kabbalah, is to reunite them. They've become estranged from each other, that the divine has become estranged from itself and that the people Israel and human beings have become estranged from God. And that process of alienation is the work of the Kabbalists to end that process of alienation. And so what has to happen is that the male has to become transformed into the female has to become transformed into the male, and they have to be reunited and rebalanced the way they were in their primal reality. Because in that most primal reality, the male and the female were united into one androgyne, queer divinity. Mm. And so the task of Kabbalah is to queer divinity. It's to reestablish at some level a gender-free, a gender-less, a transgender, a post-gender divinity. And by doing that, one has to learn to balance those forces in oneself. And so we talk a lot about the feminine aspect of God, the masculine aspect of God, that God is Yesod, is the masculine phallic aspect of God, and God is Malchut, is the feminine aspect of God, as Shekhinah. And so you have a lot of this language in the Zohar about male and female and balancing out those forces. And so it does a number on, very traditional gender roles and things like that. Now, I doesn't say it's so radical that it sort of imagines that, that in a full way you completely go beyond male and female. It talks constantly about male and female. So it certainly reifies those highly dualistic gender norms that you would have seen in the Middle Ages and you still see in the Haredi communities now. So on the one hand, it's pretty queer. And on the other hand, it's actually very conservative at the same time. And so it doesn't have the idea that, for instance, women can have lays to felon. That's never going to be in Kabbalah. They're going to know men have to do the men things, women have to do the women things. And in the Hieros Gamos, they're reunited as one. And there's lots of there's lots of like homoerotic stuff in the Zohar and homophobic stuff in the Zohar. So it goes both ways. The text is very tortured in this regard because it's trying to think through gender along lots of different vectors at once. And on the one hand, sometimes it reinforces all of the worst kind of dualistic gender roles and gender essentialism. And on the other hand, there are wonderful sections where it really undermines that stuff and gives us a radically different vision of gender. Both of them are to be found in Kabbalah. And so depending on what you go in there to look for, you'll find both of them. Queer theorists love Zohar. Hardcore gender essentialists love the Zohar because at some level it speaks to both of those, because the Zohar itself is wrestling with what to do with gender and divinity. And that's, of course, a very complicated question that many religions wrestle with. And Hebrew is also a highly gendered language. I mean, there are two and only two genders in Hebrew, at least traditional Hebrew. So, yeah, I mean, I think that like many mystics, they're dealing with incredibly difficult contradictions, and gender and the divine and the unity of God. If God is if God is fundamentally echad, right, and God is one, and the task of getting to God is a process of a yichudim, of becoming one. Well, it can't be that there are two genders or any gender. It has to be some overcoming of that process. Yeah. Of course, they struggled profoundly with these concepts, and they're also 13th century men writing in a 13th century concept. You can't expect them to be, queer theorists living in San Francisco in 2022. True. So again, I think that it's the task is to read them honestly and accurately and see them grappling with these ideas and make of that what we can.
See them for who they are in the period that they lived in.
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit about women who contributed to Kabbalah?
So if what you mean by contributed is contributed literarily to Kabbalah, well, the answer is I can tell you very little about that, because we have very little evidence of women literarily contributing to the development of Kabbalah. There's just not a ton there in the Middle Ages. But that's not to say that women weren't around. It's not to say that women weren't contributing. I mean, these guys were all married. They had to talk to their wives. When these guys came home from Safed and said, we have to make 12 chalot for Shabbat, and I'm sure the women were like, what? Or maybe the women were coming up with this stuff. Mm-hmm. So I think that one of the big problems is we don't know, because we don't have much literary evidence of how women contributed to the Kabbalah in the Middle Ages or early modern period. But at the same time, we do see them actively participating in the background. For instance, in the Shabbatian movement, women were very popular and prophetic in the Shabbatian movement. Often many women in Dybbuk cases who were possessed, almost overwhelmingly the people possessed by Dybbuks were women. So they're there and they're active and they're doing things and they're part of it. But when we look at it as if it were only a literary movement or only a practical movement or only a movement going on in the synagogues, then the women vanish. And I think the task is to, one, do more work to find if there is literary stuff, because there probably is. Mm-hmm. Two, we have to begin looking at the sociology of Kabbalah, not just the literature of Kabbalah. Because if we look at the sociology of Kabbalah, we look at the ritual practice of Kabbalah, we look at the material culture of Kabbalah, then I think that the women will come out of the background into the foreground and we'll get a much better focus on what role they played. And there is some pioneering work going on in that field. But at this point, at least, is there a Kabbalistic version of St. Teresa of Avila or a Rabia? No, we don't have that. That's just not there. We don't see that. And that's probably also a numbers game. I mean, people forget the Catholic Church was massive in the Middle Ages. There's a bunch of Catholics. The Muslim community was huge in the Middle Ages. There are a bunch of Muslims. The idea that you play the numbers game, is going to be a woman that's going to eventually pioneer something. Well, the Jewish communities are tiny comparatively. They're tiny, tiny communities. And so I think that's also just a numbers game where, that the Jewish community was so small that they're just generating less people. And therefore, at some level, you're just going to get less women objectively. And therefore, the odds of one of them popping out, to do religiously ingenious things is probably just statistically lower, unfortunately.
And there's situations where it could have happened and been buried.
It could have been. And also, we all should always remember that medieval Jews are living either in Christian lands or Muslim lands. They're not free. Mm-hmm. And so a big part of what has to go on is that Jews have to over-police their communities, which is to say they're not in a situation where they can be especially daring, at least not in public. And so there's just no way that a conservatively minded Jewish community is going to let women get too out of the reins, because then they would easily earn the ire of their Christian neighbors, who are eventually going to expel them from Spain anyway. I mean, that's already lined up. Yeah. And ditto in the Muslim world, the Ottoman Empire was much, much more tolerant, but much more tolerant of women having leadership roles and these strange mystical communities, probably not. And so also there's just again, you're talking about an insular community living at the behest of people whom they may have antagonistic relations with, to say the least. Mm.
So basically they had to hide their religion a lot of the time to kind of...
Yeah, they had to censor works. I mean, Nachmanides, who was a pretty famous Kabbalist, one of the earliest Kabbalists, had to actively argue with Christians in public in these disputationes, where he had to basically argue with Christians that Jews should be even allowed to live in their lands. And so you're in a situation where you just have to basically defend your right to exist. You're not going to go out of your way to let people that hate you know that you have a lot of other weird beliefs that might alarm them, or let gender roles get too out of control, where that would be something that they would target you for whatever reason.
Can you talk a little bit about the possibility of the first transgendered poets? I'm gonna murder this name. Mm-hmm. Kalinus family?
Yeah. No, this is from the Kalonymus family. The Kalonymus family were Jews originally from Greece who had immigrated to Italy. There's a great book about this, about queer and trans and LGBTQ Jews in the Middle Ages, called the Rainbow Thread. I think it's what it's called. It's a really good book. But what we have basically is a poem written by one of the members of the Kalonymus family, a very powerful Jewish family, and he laments not having been born a woman. And he goes into great detail of all the ways in which he wishes he was born a woman. And there's a kind of idea in which, on the one hand, the traditional prayer, right, is, thank you, God, Shalom Asani Isha, Thank you, God, for having made me not be a woman. And this poem subverts that, where he actually says, no, I wish I were born a woman. And I feel all this kind of weird religious guilt about this desire to be a woman. And a lot of contemporary scholars have looked at this, and he goes on and on and on about all the things he wishes he could do as a woman, wear these clothes and things like this. And so it seems to be, I don't know if he was the first trans poet, but he certainly, she clearly has a deep desire to not live in the gender they were assigned, and has really thought carefully and poetically about the tragedy of having been born, to their mind, perhaps in the wrong gender. And therefore, if they were living in a different time, would they have been the kind of person that would have transitioned? Maybe. That seems reasonable to me. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But this is a great poem from the Kalanimus family. Kalanimus, a lot of them have the same name. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to check the book out, for any folks out there that are interested in sort of medieval, early modern LGBTQ folks, The Rainbow Thread, it's an anthology of these materials in which this particular poem is in there.
That's cool. I actually have heard of the book, so that's why we put that in there.
It's a good book. It's a great book. It's not particularly Kabbalistic, but it's a good book just the same.
There's a rumor or myth going around in the Torah or one of the Kabbalah books that mentions that there were spirits, entities, or godlike beings before man. Can you debunk this myth or speak about it?
So there certainly is the case that there are creatures made before people, or creatures that existed just eternally alongside with God. These creatures are called the Tanaim, the ones of the deep ones. It's very Lovecraftian. Those entities just sort of were there, it appears, in the Hebrew Bible, in the sort of murky waters of primordial chaos. And the Zohar makes a big deal about them. Really, the Zohar really, in Zohar 2, somewhere around 35 or so, it really ascribes them the origin of evil itself. They really think that these beings are these Tanaim. Leviathan is the progenitor of metaphysical evil. So the Zohar makes a big deal about them. So there are now. The rabbinical literature also makes mention of these spirits that were created right before the first Shabbat, and because they were created right before the first Shabbat, right when God was going to rest and everything else was going to rest, they never got bodies. And because they never got bodies, and we did, they hate us. And these become the ruchot, the spirits, or the shadim, the devils, the demons. And so they're kind of pitted against us. And in Kabbalistic literature, they tend to emerge from what's called the Sitra Achra, the other side. Mm-hmm. This is a kind of dross thrown off by the Sphira of Din or Guvura. And that dross thrown off by Din or Guvura is kind of unchecked by mercy, unchecked by chesed, and that becomes evil. It becomes evil, and that forms an opposite side of the Sphirot. And evil dwells in there, and there are all kinds of demonic beings that get generated in that moment. And so, insofar as that story for the creation of evil, the idea of that evil is created as a part of Sitra Achra, the other side, then sure, like in some sense, that world exists before Malchut by definition, and that's before our world comes into existence. Although Adam Kadmon kind of existed prior to that, and that's where the souls of all human beings come from. And depending on how you read your Zohar, no one had physical existence until the sin of Adam, and then that basically plunged all the spirits, all the spiritual substances into physical reality in a very Gnostic kind of way. So the answer is yes, but it depends on what stories you want to read, because there are half a dozen stories. They don't logically make sense together, and you have to kind of pick and choose which of these stories from rabbinical literature, from the Midrashim, from the Talmud, from the Zohar, from later literature like stuff written by Isaac Luria or really written by Chaim Vital, it all depends on which of these pieces of literature you want to pick up and go with. So it really, yeah. So the answer is yeah. There are all kinds of things that existed before human beings. The question is, what do you mean by human beings? What do you mean by before them? What do you mean by other kinds of creatures? So the answer is yes, and the answer is, and it's really complicated.
I did not want to kind of focus on throughout this one about the Dybbuk and the Dybbuk box, but I know that the Dybbuk is in Jewish folklore. Can you explain or debunk Dybbuk boxes and explain what the Dybbuk actually is for the public, please?
Yeah, of course. So Dybbuks are a primarily 16th century Kabbalistic development. I'm actually doing a big episode this week on how Dybbuks developed, the concept of Dybbuks. So basically, Dybbuks are people in life that committed such atrocious sins that they don't warrant Gehenna. So Gehenna is the closest thing you're going to get to Jewish hell. It's a place of torment, spiritual torment, that lasts exactly 1 day shy of a Jewish year. And because whatever sins you committed, you have to be purified of them, you go to this place of torment, and for not more than 1 year, you're tormented there and you're purified of your sins. Well, some people commit sins that are so bad, they don't even merit that. And so their soul doesn't go to hell. It simply has to roam around forever. They're sort of stuck in the limbo of this world. And this is apparently incredibly agonizing. It's agony to not have a body. Bodies are a core part of Judaism. Judaism is not a religion that says your soul is really you and, you know, you're going to escape this world. I mean, your body's bad. It's like Gnosticism. Judaism is not Gnostic in that way. We love our bodies. We celebrate our bodies. We are all about being embodied. And so the idea of a soul without a body is a horrifying idea in Judaism, in a way that I think maybe some Christians and other religions are like, yeah, that's the whole point, is to get out of our body. Judaism is nothing like that. And so the soul of this especially sinful person is doomed to roam around without a body. And this is incredibly agonizing for them, much more agonizing than being in Gehenna. Being in Gehenna is bad, but at least you're only there for 1 day shy of a year or whatever.
Yeah.
And even get Shabbat off. The punishments end on Shabbat. You're not allowed to be punished on Shabbat even. So these spirits of dead people who are sinful want to get back into a body. And so what they do is they attempt a process called ibur, impregnation, in which they, because of a sin committed by a person, that opens up their sin to become impregnated with the soul of this sinful person. And they cling to the souls of the living. They want to live in the souls of the living. The problem is the soul is a very sinful, bad soul, and it acts as a kind of parasite on the soul of decent people, of good people. It can cause them to become evil and make bad decisions, and you don't want that. And so the word for to cling to in Hebrew is dabak. In fact, the word glue in Hebrew is from the same root word. And so the Dybbuk is just a soul that has gotten into a person, an evil soul that has gotten into a person and is clinging to them. And this clinging to them is kind of a parasitic relationship. And so the task of an exorcist is to expel the Dybbuk from that person. So Dybbuks mostly want to live in people, although they can't live there forever without killing the host, if they will physically kill the host. In fact, most early Dybbuk exorcisms in the 16th century killed the people that they were in. So they want to be in people, but if they can't be in people, they can temporarily be in animals. They can temporarily be in animals, and they can even sometimes be in things that used to be animals, like meat or leather or something. But they can't be in boxes. They have to live inside of something. They have to live inside of something with a soul or something that recently had a soul. And so a Dybbuk can't get into a box because a Dybbuk has to get into a spiritual thing. And so there's no way to trap a Dybbuk in a box. They have to go from soul to soul. And now they can travel great distances to get into a soul, but they don't want to be outside of a soul. It's incredibly agonizing to them. And so I don't know of any literature, Jewish literature, Kabbalistic literature, in which Dybbuk's could be put into boxes. And I don't know that idea ever developed until that story from like an eBay auction in like the 2000s, where this idea came from. Now, let me say something about folklore. Folklore isn't a static thing. Folklore it isn't frozen. It's not concrete. Folklore changes.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, I don't want to be the guy saying Dybbuk's can't go in boxes and therefore Dybbuk boxes are stupid and no one should ever tell stories like that. That's not for me to say. What I can say is there's no reason in Jewish folklore up to the moment in which someone made a story about a Dybbuk box in which Dybbuk's could ever go into boxes, because that makes no sense given what Dybbuk's are and how they operate.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to tell anyone what horror movies to make. Like, people can make whatever movies they like.
True.
What I would say is I think you would actually make better horror movies if you stuck to the folklore, because the folklore is very rich. And the actual traditional folklore is very rich and very complicated and has all kinds of cool rules about how Dybbuk's work and how they don't work, who they can target, who they can, how they target them, etc. So Dybbuk boxes, basically a thing that got invented 10 years ago. Prior to that, I don't know of any stories in which Dybbuk's ever were put into non-living things. They have to go into something that's either living or something that's very recently dead. There are a couple of cases of Dybbuk's where the Dybbuk has left the body of, like, they've gone out of a body and that body has perished, and they've come back into the same body rapidly. But when they come back in, they're no longer animated that body anymore. The body's just sort of weirdly moving around. So they can get back into their previous dead body, but only if it's very, very, very recent in terms of how long they can do this. And there's a custom in Judaism called being a shomer.
Yeah.
This is the custom where if a person's died, the corpse is never allowed to be alone. They always have to be with another living human being. And typically, traditionally, the task of that human being is to stay up with them all night long until they get buried and read Psalms and the Zohar and other kinds of holy text, precisely to prevent a Dybbuk from coming in and getting into them. That first 24-hour period is very crucial. And so the idea is that the task of a shomer is to prevent that from happening. And you have whole committees of people in Jewish communities who sign up for a 2-hour block of time at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. or whatever to protect the body from Dybbuk's. There's a great movie about this called The Vigil, which I would say, if you're a big fan of horror films, The Vigil is a incredibly well-made Jewish horror film that talks about, that smartly discusses Jewish demonology, and not Dybbuk specifically. That deals more with a specific kind of demon called a mazik. But it's a great film if you're in the mood for a spooky Halloween movie that's Kabbalistically inspired and Jewish. The ritual, The Vigil is a really good one. But
we've been looking for it ourselves for a while. We can't get it here. We have to order it from outside the country for some reason.
Weird.
I don't know why we haven't been able to locate it.
Maybe just try to do a streaming on a VPN that's not a Canadian VPN. You might be able to get it streaming via a non-Canadian IP or something. But
yeah,
it's a good movie. It was on the local sort of. I was on a panel about it, and I was thinking I was going to be disappointed, but I was pleasantly surprised by how well done it was.
I've heard that, and like I'm going to see if I can try and get it up for Halloween.
Yeah. It's a good book. It's a good story.
Yeah. Last question. Do you have anything you'd like to touch on that we haven't talked about that you would like to say?
Anything we haven't touched on? I guess what I would say is that we're living in the golden age of Kabbalah in terms of access to literature. We have access to more literature than anyone has ever had access in Kabbalistic history. And I think that many people, especially people who are coming into Kabbalah through the Hermetic Kabbalah or through Western occultism, they kind of had the attitude that Kabbalah is like frozen in time in like the early 20th century with MacGregor Mathers or whatever. And what I would say is that's wrong. There's a lot of Kabbalah out there. Yeah. And that if your only experience of Kabbalah is Hermetic Kabbalah in the form of Aleister Crowley's 777 or really early crappy translations of Sefer Yetzirah by McGregor Mathers or whatever. I would just say that scholarship has been long outdated, and that now you have access to incredibly rigorous, high quality translations of all the major Kabbalistic classics, Sefer Yetzirah, Sefer Bahir, Sefer Zohar. And so I would just encourage people for whom they have an interest in Kabbalah that, sort of hit refresh on what you think is out there.
Yeah.
Because there is a ton of high quality stuff out there. And I would just encourage people to dive into that material. And I think it would enrich their knowledge base of Kabbalah, but I think it would also enrich their spirituality and their practice at some level. There's such a rich literature. It's had such a decisive impact on Western esotericism. There is no Western esotericism without Kabbalah, one of the pillars of Western esotericism. And so insofar as that's true, I think it is I'd encourage people to dive into it, no matter what level of Hebrew you have, no matter what level of study you have, no matter what level of what you think you know, give it a shot, and you might surprise yourself, and I'm sure you'll get something out of it.
My original introduction was the Hermetic Kabbalah and the 777, and because in originally reading that, how confused I was, I went to the other sources to kind of get the background of where Aleister Crowley came from. And I figured he was not the greatest student of Kabbalah. He was good. He was really good at what he did and what he created. But to me, there was something missing. And so I'm going further. I'm going to read the Zohar and see, I want to learn Hebrew so that I can read it in the Hebrew, because I know full well that English translations, there's going to be certain words and certain inflections that are not going to translate to English in any way. So, and it's the same with the Bible. I took 10 different Bibles, and each one of them had different wording because they were translated by a different person, and so the wording was different, and you can have wide variety of aspects of that. And so
it's a task. It's a task. I'll also say that 777 is a badly outdated book, frankly. The Hebrew in there is a mess, and Crowley's understanding of Kabbalah is more miss than hit. So again, I think that Thelema and other religions who look to Crowley's legitimate genius also have to realize that every genius has a horizon. And if we let as much as I love Bach, and I think Bach is the best thing ever happened to music, but if I limited myself to Bach and thought that all music, the horizon of music was Bach, I'm not really doing myself a favor by maintaining that, no matter how much of a genius Bach was. And so it doesn't matter how much of a genius Crowley was, and he certainly was of a certain kind, but to think that mysticism and magic and occultism, or basically the horizon of them, was Aleister Crowley in the 1920s or something, that just seems that's patently wrong. It's patently that would be bizarre if it were true. So I would just encourage people to realize that the horizon for Kabbalah, the horizon for what is accessible, has much outstripped things like 777, and 777 is historically fascinating, but it is a deeply flawed text when it comes to its understanding of Kabbalah and even the Hebrew language, frankly.
Is there anything you want to promote before we go off?
I would say that, if folks are interested in Kabbalah, I have a lot of Kabbalah videos on my channel. It's a great start. Again, I always tell people Esoterica my channel is a place to start your research. It is a place that will help you get your footing on your research. It'll give you some access to text. Almost all my episodes have book recommendations that'll give you access to grounded literature, because there's a lot of ungrounded literature in Kabbalah. And so if folks are interested in Kabbalah, they can check out my episodes on Kabbalah. But also I have a long I think 14 episode long lecture series on Kabbalah. That's, I think, one of the more exhaustive on the internet at this point. It's not perfect, but it's certainly better than a lot of things out there. So I would say that if folks want access to something digestible but still rigorous, Esoterica, the content I produce on Kabbalah, I think is pretty good overall. And I encourage folks to check it out as a stepping stone as in their journey into studying Kabbalah more deeply.
Thank you. That 14 episode stretch, in it, what actually draws me to you as a person is how well you disseminate the knowledge in a way that's easily digestible. It's very hard to do that, and you do it well.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I think that just because things are esoteric doesn't mean that they have to remain that way. And so Esoterica, the channel I run, has a very ironic mandate, and that's to make Esoterica not esoteric. So yeah, I think that one can do that to some degree. There's always some loss in that process, but it's about empowering people to learn themselves, because obviously you'll never learn better than when you're doing the teaching to yourself.
True. Well, thank you for coming on.
Of course. Thank you for inviting me on.
I wish to thank Dr. Justin Sledge for coming on the show with us. His way of giving us an intricate subject in an easy, digestible way is wonderful. We support him and hope you will too. I'll put links to his channel and works in the show notes. As always, thank you for joining us, and please like, follow, and subscribe on whatever platforms you're following us on.